sincere, but I think that what he would say is, well, I mean, there's a question about if the philosophers have the truth, why don't we just tell everyone philosophical truths and dispense with the Quran? And he has an answer for that, which is that the Quran is a presentation of the same truths that philosophers grasp, but in a way that most people can understand and accept and find persuasive. That's what's special about revealed texts, is that they're more persuasive, they're easier for people to grasp because they use imagery and so on. And since most people are not capable of doing philosophy, either because they don't have the requisite talent, or if they do, they don't have time, they're too busy putting food on their table, you have a very small number of people who are able to figure this stuff out on their own and by using the works of the great Greek philosophers. So for everybody else, there's religion. Now, what that means is that people who believe in religion are believing in the truth, but they're maybe believing in it in a way that's not the most perspicuous. So, for example, when they believe in life after death, what they believe is that their body will be resurrected and they'll go to a garden where there will be lots of water and trees. And it'll be very nice. Or they'll go to hell if they've been bad and they'll burn in fire. What Averroes would say is, well, that's close. Actually, you'll be an immaterial intellect, which will exist for all time. But at least you've grasped the key point, which is that you will live on after you die.
Amira, how did this, as it were, double track play in the society of Avarroes at the time?
Well, I think again,
the religion and philosophy, because
yes, I think this again brings us back to this the specificity of the Almohad era in the Islamic West. The Almohadism itself had this
ruling
sort of
dynasty.
The Almohads are the rulers, and Almohadism, if you like, is a particular interpretation of Islam, which is supporting philosophy, because it was in itself inherently hierarchical right from the period of the founder, whom I mentioned earlier, Ibn Tumat. There was this emphasis on, if you like, a very complicated, rational profession of faith, which only the inner circle of the Almohads could understand, and then a hierarchy of Almohad followers from the top down. And at each level, you needed to present material in a more simplified way until you got to the masses at the bottom. There had, traditionally within Islamic society been the concept of a division between the Amma, the common people, and the Khasa, the elite. Now, whether you were talking about society or intellectual life, that those terms actually have quite different meanings, but they were taken by the philosophers to denote this distinction between the common people who, as Peter was saying, can't understand philosophical truths, but can understand truth presented as revelation through a revealed text. So you had inherent in Almohadism this sense of a hierarchy, and Averroes' thought then fitted into that.
But we are talking about parallel. We are talking about tracks going in much the same direction. That religion was a metaphor for truth that could be appreciated by everybody, whereas philosophy was an instrument for getting at the truth, much finer and more incisive. But they were not in contradiction.
But I think that exactly that is what Averroes says. I think it's very difficult to accept that his philosophical system is not really in contradiction with either.
I mean, he said that politically, you say.
Muslim or Christian thought. I mean, there are two doctrines in particular that caused difficulty. One was that, like Aristotle, Averroes believed that the world had always existed. There was never a beginning of the world or a beginning of time. Whereas on the face of it, in the sacred texts, both Muslim and Christian, God created the world at a specific time, at a beginning. And Averroes has to go to through a lot of rather sophisticated philosophy to show that he's not contradicting the doctrine of creation, that at every moment the world does depend on God who keeps it in existence. He says that he claims that the difference between him and those who say that the world was created in time is just a verbal difference, really. The other doctrine is the question of personal immortality. I think you said that he believed that when you that when you die, you don't go to the beautiful garden or anything. You are just a disembodied intellect. But I think you aren't you anymore either, because the disembodied intellect in Averroes' system is a single world intellect. It's not something that belongs to you and me. I mean, we would naturally think of the four of us as each having our own intellect and our own thoughts and so on. For Averroes, that's not really so. Each of us has our own imagination. That's something personal and private. But really intellectual thought, that is something that happens in a single universal intellect. It's very difficult to understand this. I try to explain it to people that he thought of the intellect as being something like the internet, that as there's all this information on the internet, and occasionally we tune in to bits of it. So for Averroes, as it were, the imagination is a kind of Google that links up from time to time into the great body of disembodied science. And when you die, of course, your body and your brain, your imagination, they all vanish. And all that happens, all that remains, is this single intellectual mind. Now, if that counts as personal survival, I think most people who believe in an afterlife would say that it's a complete cheat. Yeah, it's not really individual.
I certainly agree with that.
Yeah.
And can I just please say what you're going to say, but can I just add something else, Peter? Everything you said there was Avarroes, and yet we're talking about Avarroes translating Aristotle. So Aristotle talking through Averroes. Is Averroes bending Aristotle in any way to Peter Adamson to accommodate the opposition that there will inevitably be?
The texts that Averroes is dealing with here are some of the most difficult and controversial texts Aristotle wrote in the third book of his work on the soul, and you have a long history of different interpretations. Something that's interesting about Averroes is that he goes through a whole series of different interpretations of this. The one that was just described is his his most famous view that he comes to in his great commentary on this work, on the soul. And what's interesting about it is that in general, we were talking before about how Avicenna is the most original thinker of the Islamic tradition. In general, Averroes doesn't like Avicenna. So he thinks that Avicenna is departing too much from Aristotle. And in fact, in the work that you mentioned, Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers, when Averroes criticizes that, usually what he says is, well, Ghazali is right that Avicenna's views are wrong, but since Avicenna's views don't represent those of the philosophers, because he's got Aristotle wrong, we can ignore this entire debate. For example, on the eternity of the world, right? He agrees with Avicenna and Aristotle that the world is eternal, but he doesn't agree with Avicenna's reasons for thinking the world is eternal. Now, the case of the intellect is an interesting one, because in this case, he takes a view that's somewhat like Avicenna's, but goes even further than Avicenna in what we would probably think of as a departure from Aristotle. So in terms of the philosophy of why you would think all of this craziness about all of humanity having only one intellect, actually this all makes perfect sense. And the reason it makes perfect sense is that Aristotle says that when your intellect grasps an idea, what that is for your mind to become identical with the idea. So if I grasp what frogs are, what that means is that my mind is somehow becoming conformed or identical with frog. Now, there's only one idea of frog. There's lots of frogs, but there's only one idea of frog. So that means that there can't really be any difference between what's going on when I grasp frog and what's going on when Amira grasps frog. Although, of course, we have different imaginations and things that go along with it. So I imagine Kermit because I'm from the States. Amira imagines whatever British people think of when they think of frogs. Now, Averroes, so if you think about the difference between Avicenna and Averroes on this, what Avicenna thinks follows from all of this is simply that what happens when we die is that we become an immaterial soul that just does intellection. It doesn't do anything else. Averroes goes that one better and says, well, if we take that really seriously, then we have to admit that there's only one of these, because there's only one set of ideas, there's only one set of universal principles, and that's what we will become identical to after we die. So it all makes perfect sense.
Amira, when did these ideas of Averroes crash into conflict with the court to such an extent that he was exiled?
I'm not
And
sure.
why? What was it?
Yes, I'm not sure they did come into conflict at the court. As Tony was saying earlier, you sort of have these different groupings of the religious scholars, the theologians, and the court itself. Averroes had a long career as a court physician, but he did fall foul, I think, of the jurists, the most sort of legal-minded Islamic scholars of the Iberian Peninsula at that time, and they put a quite considerable pressure on the caliph. The caliph at that time was Al-Mansur, to do something about the irreligiosity of this individual who was so highly placed. And it's at that point that you then get sort of the story that Tony was mentioning coming in, this reference to a pagan, to Venus, and naming her as a divinity, which was used, if in any way, as a sort of an excuse to remove him from the court. Whilst we talk in terms of banishment, I mean, I tend to think of it more in terms of the caliph himself sort of, apologising profusely and saying, look, I think you better go undercover for a bit. Things are a bit hot here. The scholars are on my tail. I think you really need to move out of the limelight. And the caliph didn't want to be seen to be patronising philosophy at that particular moment. So Averroes was sent to Lucena, which was slightly humiliating. This was seen as a city inhabited primarily with Jews. On the positive side, it's quite possible that it was in that milieu that he came into contact with Jews and helped transmit his ideas into the Jewish Spanish milieu. But he was subsequently recalled to court, and I think it's important to realise that he was recalled by Al-Mansur. When Al-Mansur left the Iberian Peninsula for Marrakesh in 1198, he wanted to take his philosopher with him, and he summoned Averroes back, took him down to Marrakesh. I mean, again, that's sometimes been seen in a negative light, but I think we have to remember that Marrakesh was the Almohad capital, and it was there that Averroes actually passed away shortly afterwards.